It is now my great pleasure to hand over to our next chair, Laszlo Horvath from Birkbeck University of London. Thank you, Laszlo, for volunteering to chair. And this is a panel on perspectives on media effects.
Thanks. So I'll be doing the timekeeping now on the media effects panel, which is going to be up to 25 minutes, including Q&A. So I'd like to ask someone from the Wojcieszak and colleagues paper about exposure to political content beyond news to come forward and present.
Yes, that would be.
And I'm sorry, I will be interrupting you at the 12-minute mark, and that means that you have about 3 minutes left.
Okay. Yes, I'm Bernhard, and I'm going to present this paper. Let me share my screen. Let me know if you cannot see my screen. Can you see this all right?
Yep.
All right, so this is work in progress with my collaborators, Magdalena, Wojcieszak, Sjifra, Leeuw, Ericka, Menchen-Trevino, who I think is also in the audience, João Gonçalves and Sam Davidson from the universities of Amsterdam, the American University, California Davies, and Rotterdam. And I don't need to tell you, well, I'm telling you anyway, I guess, that we all think that, or there's this idea that news media contribute to the effective functioning of democracy by informing citizens, for example, by holding politics to account, by increasing political engagement and so forth. And of course, this is why researchers study how much news people consume, what kind of news they consume, and what the effects of this consumption are. So the news consumption is the broccoli that you really want your children to eat as it's nice and healthy. But actually, as much as children really like pizza with lots of cheese and salami on top, the public is also perhaps not so much into news as we might hope. We know, for example, that in the US, where this has been studied extensively, many people are politically disengaged. They see news as boring, and they're quite averse to parts of politics. Some more stats on this would be that only 4% of people's news feed on Facebook is news, and recent studies using trace data, so behavioral browsing data, just as this study actually, show that the percentage of news browsing in relation to all browsing is well below 10%. Our main point is that the previous literature might be missing something here because, well, A, we see that there is so much exposure to content outside of news, and this is something to look at, and especially since political content is not necessarily synonymous to news content. So in a sense, all these questions that we're interested in, you know, how does news consumption affect certain democracy-relevant attitudes and behaviors? We often imagine them to be relevant because the content is supposed to be political, but actually it's not so clear that these two things, news and political content, are the same thing and should be treated as such. Just to give you an example to illustrate this point, here you see, for example, the website of Fox News, and many people go to Fox News or other news sites like the New York Times for entertainment, sports, cooking, whatever. At the same time, people also go to other sites for political information, right? They might go to like magazines or sites that we wouldn't consider news to read about vaccination, for example. They might also go to sites of, I don't know, government sites where they're exposed to political information. So in a sentence, visiting a news site is not synonymous with political exposure. And of course, we know that, right? We in surveys, we ask users whether they are incidentally exposed to politics outside of their news browsing, and we know they are. And we also know that these kind of incidental exposures have these effects that we care about, right? But we also know that survey self-reports are often problematic. They might not measure actual exposure. And this is why we do this project, because we want to address both the theoretical gap of the kind of intermingling of news exposure and exposure to political content, which we think should be treated separately. And also we want to go beyond studies using self-reports by looking at behavioral trace data. So we do this in 3 countries, the US, Netherlands, Poland, using behavioral trace data to assess the prevalence of exposure to news domains, to political content within these news domains, and to political content outside news domains. And as I said, this is work in progress, so we haven't actually got to looking at the effects of these more complicated exposure measures. So in other words, to pick up on that metaphor of broccoli and pizza, we really want to look at the pizza with the broccoli. If you've, at least in Tuscany, where I did my PhD, it's actually it's quite common to put something called friarelli on your pizza, which is a bit similar to broccoli. It's quite nice. So you know, it's more common than you think, actually. So it's a bit like, you know, the political content outside of news exposure, I guess. So just to kind of give you, don't squint your eyes, don't try to recognize anything here. It's just to illustrate that this is a panel study done in 3 countries. So we have 3 waves in 3 countries. In each wave, we administer a survey, and before people can actually complete the survey, they have to, well, we ask them to donate their browsing history of 3 months before. So that would be the 3 months before wave 1, and then in the ensuing waves, the time between the wave and the previous wave. And we do this with a tool called Web Historian, which my collaborator, Ericka Menchen-Trevino, who I think might be in the audience, programmed. And it's basically a way, like an open source way to share your data. It gives respondents the possibility to also exclude domains they do not want to share, and visualizes kind of this process. And you can visit it on this URL. So what do we have? What does that give us? We have, I'm just here talking about the first wave. So all the descriptors I'm going to give you in this presentation are about 1 wave, because we haven't done the overtime effects analyses yet. So we're talking in this presentation about roughly 64 million visits. And we match these visits. So for each visit, we have a domain, and we match this domain to a list of news organization domains, and also their social media pages. And this list of news organizations comprises in the US about 1,700 organizations, and in the Netherlands and Poland, it's less than 300 roughly. So this is how we measure exposure to news. How do we measure exposure to political content? We use the titles of news visits. So I didn't actually know this before I joined this project. Title is basically what you see in your on the browser tab. So if you have several tabs in your browser, you will see that there's a little sentence or half sentence describing the content in some sort of way. We apply a multilingual BERT classifier to classify whether a site, a visit is political or not. This classifier has quite a good accuracy of 90%. And this, of course, lets us understand how much content within and outside of news is political or non-political. All right, so what do we find on this descriptive level? How much broccoli is there in both in news and non-news? So first of all, we find, and that basically is in line with the literature, that news exposure is quite low. So we have percentages between 2 and 4%, depending on the country, of visits to news domains in relation to all visits. How about political content within the news domains? Here, and this is perhaps a more striking finding, we see that actually exposure to political content is lower than we may expect. And this means, in terms of numbers, between 14 and 35% only is actually to political content. We here give you the percentage of homepage visits separately, because that's obviously something which is hard to classify, right? The homepage has both political and non-political items, so we wouldn't want to classify that in any way. How about political content outside of news domains? These are percentages of between 1.2 and 2%, which sounds quite low, but as I will discuss in a minute, actually, given the absolute amount of non-news content, this is actually quite a lot. So as I said, we in the next step, we are going to analyze try to tease out the effects of exposure to these different kinds of to news, non-news, political, non-political. So for now, we can only conclude about these more descriptive findings in line with previous research, that the exposure to news is actually very small. It varies a bit depending on the country. And this might also explain, just in brackets, why some previous papers using trace data to examine effects of news exposure, they actually find very small or null effects simply because the overall news exposure is so small. And this here, I'm referencing a paper of my collaborators. So the broccoli with pizza. So there are few visits to explicitly political titles in news, and many more to non-political titles in news domains. And this is true across the countries, even though because of different prevalences of homepage visits, these differences, as you see, vary a bit across countries. So in the Netherlands and Poland, there are many more homepage visits. So now another interesting conclusion is that even though in percentages the political content outside of news is quite small, given the sheer amount of these sites and of visits to non-news sites, in absolute, there are actually over twice as many political titles outside of news sites as in news sites, and we find this quite striking. And we also looked a bit at like what kind of domains contributes to this, and to just give you two examples. For example, in the Netherlands, the site of the voting advice application, there's I think it's called the Keys Compass. It was extremely popular. So this would of course be classified by our classifier as political, but it's not news. And in the US, for example, we have many visits to YouTube content that is not linked to any news organization, right? So just picture, some, I don't know, video blogger talking about, let's say, I don't know, the conspiracy theory that vaccines cause autism. And this would probably be picked up as political, but is not something we consider news. Perhaps some considerations to conclude with. Right now, when we present these percentages, the denominator is always all browsing. So this includes lots of visits to like shipping sites and survey sites, and of course, people in our sample go to survey sites a lot. That's actually an interesting side note, that you realize how some of these people are like semi-professional survey takers. And then, of course, visits to email services and that sort of stuff. And so far, we don't exclude this. We do some kind of deduplication to get rid of for example, when a page reloads automatically, and this would give us 2 observations in our data, we exclude, we deduplicate this on a per days per person basis. But so far, we keep all this browsing in the denominator, and we might also, as a kind of robustness check or comparison, we might also include some of these. But I'm also interested to hear what you think about this, what people's experiences are with these issues.
Sorry, if you can wrap it up in a minute, under a minute,
yeah,
that would be good.
That is actually, that happens to me my last slide. So, of course, this opens lots and lots of questions as well. What actually, so we're talking about political content outside of news. It would be interesting to understand a bit better what kind of political content outside there is outside news, and how it is different from political news content. And of course, as I said, ongoing work is on this project is going into the effects of these different kind of exposures. And then, of course, you can look at many interesting and saucy things when you have these data. For example, we realized that there was much more exposure to porn sites than to news sites, actually. So an interesting question would be how that correlates or predicts political or other types of attitudes and reported behaviors. On that note, I thank you for listening, and look forward to your questions.
Thanks for that. Thank you for the lunchtime appropriate presentation for us. I'm going to start with, I think there are already quite a few questions, so I'm just going to start reading the first. Could you please elaborate a bit on how you operationalized political versus news sites and how complex it was to do that across different media systems? And I'm going to join this with the next question, which is related, which is about what counts as political across cultural contexts. Can you talk more about how the classifier works and was trained?
Yeah, I can talk a bit about this. Maybe Ericka can also, I see she's here, chime in on that if she wants. So first about the political versus non-political, well, we manually labeled titles in all 3 countries. This was, I don't have the reliability statistics from the top of my head, but generally we made sure that this manual coding was reliable, and this was the basis for training the algorithm. So if there are any like cross-cultural differences, it's not necessarily so easy to say explicitly what they are, because the people who did the coding, they were kind of embedded in their cultural political context anyway. So yeah, I hope that that kind of answers the question. If not, then feel free to
I think it's simultaneously your co-author is answering these questions too. So
Okay, that's good.
I think these questions are
full
all
blast.
Yes. I'm just going to pick because so some of these are answered. I'll just pick one, and then if there is nothing else, I'll ask my questions. So can you say about non-news sites? YouTube is one example, but have you included partisan sites, bloggers, etc., in news or non-news? Are you looking at Twitter and Facebook data? Also, this is all desktop, right? Not mobile.
Yes, it is. So last question first. This is all
Yes.
desktop, which is of course a shortcoming. I guess it is something that, you know, we as a community of researchers have to address. I don't really know how many studies have been done yet that kind of managed to get both mobile and desktop data. We do ask people at some point how much of their browsing in general is done on desktop versus mobile. So in theory, we have some kind of measures to adjust for that, but that is definitely a problem. The other question was about what exactly goes into our news list. So we have these lists for each country. They are basically so we started in all three countries. We started with like 3 components: the top 1,000 domains browsed in our data, the top 1,000 Alexa domains, and the top 1,000 domains tweeted by politicians in each country. And then we coded these for whether they were news domains or not. In the US, so this will obviously mostly yield like very mainstream news sites. In the US, we enriched this with 2 very long and extensive lists of newspapers across the US that really contained like lots of local small outlets you will never even have heard of, as well as TV channels. So basically all local TV channels who often have their own domains actually. So yeah, that's how we got these lists. I think there was something about YouTube in that question.
I think it's just about whether, for example, a YouTube, which would be, you know, the domain would be YouTube, but whether on the subdomain level, if it's a YouTube partisan or a politician's YouTube channel itself, whether you can see that in the data.
So I was a bit imprecise about when I talked about domains. We don't only match to domains, but also in the case of these bigger sites like YouTube, or in the case of social media sites in particular, we also, for this list of news organizations, we have their Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages, which is not a domain, but will be something like youtube.com, and then, you know, either some ID or the name of the account. So and then we also check whether people visit these, but of course that's still missing. That's missing the political content, you know, that's not put out by these news organizations, but, you know, by whoever, you know.
Yeah. All right. Then I think we still have a few more minutes, and if there is nothing else, I had one technical question that you don't have to answer, and a non-technical question that you can answer, which is, so I was thinking, and it seems like with it's not exactly passive web tracking, because there is an element of for each record you have, the respondent could have decided whether they want to submit that record for you or not.
Yeah.
But then I'm wondering if there is an unequal tracking period across these individuals, and if maybe so some of them you get tracking data from them for a few days, so some of them for the entire study period, then I wonder if these percentages you're showing also across countries, whether they could be adjusted to that unequal tracking period, so that you know that percentage might be driven by outliers or something like that. So I don't know if you want to pick up on this, or the other simpler question that I had is, I know you have lots of analysis to do, but have you checked correlations with self-reported exposure to news, and did you learn something? Do they over-report? Do they under-report? What do they do?
Yeah. Both great questions. I'll answer the second one, and maybe then Ericka can respond to the first one. So we will do that. We will compare self-reports to browsing behavior, but actually in a separate project. So we'll make that a paper on measurement of.
Yeah, we have a pre-registration on that, Bernhard, so you could share that if you want to. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
will.
For the trace versus self-report one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that'll be another paper. For the first question, it's complicated. So just we did do. You're correct, of course, that some people had more browsing data than others. But if we look at the median participant, it's, they have a day span of roughly 88 days out of possible 90, and are active on 60 of those days. So that's the median person. So we don't do a day-by-day adjustment for this necessarily. There's a number of ways to go about it. It could be days, it could be persons. For this paper, we went with sort of bulk aggregation for it, and but we're still considering, the best approach, and also the best approach to deduplicating the records and things like that. So there's a lot of decisions to be made on that level as well to kind of finalize that.
Okay, thanks for that. We're going to now move on to the next paper, I think, because it is time, which is going to be Waismel-Manor and colleagues' paper on mediated exposure to corruption.
Hi, and thanks everybody for coming. Let me share the screen and set it. Okay, so first of all, this is this paper, which we titled Does Corruption Corrupt? The Behavioral Effects of Mediated Exposure to Corruption, is a collaborative effort with Patricia from the University stuck here. University of Washington, and Rico, Neumann, and Moran, Shechnick, and all together pull this thing together. Now, over the last 20 years, there's been a huge increase in the study of corruption. It started mostly by legal scholars who were interested in the phenomena and why it's so prevalent, but it also diffused into the social sciences in general, with more and more people interested in what corruption is, who are the people who are the most corrupt, but it mostly focuses on corruption at the top levels of government and city officials and companies, and it has less to do, or it's less explored, its connection to citizens. Now, when we talk about corruption, we think usually of two types. The one we hear most is the grand corruption, and those are those stories that you hear that this prime minister gave preferential treatment to their daughter, or this politician who appointed somebody else for money. Graft in general. This is obviously not something new. It's as old as politics. There's been corruption. The one we less hear about, it's the societal corruption. In a sense, those are the small behaviors of individuals that break the law, that make something that shouldn't be done. And what we were really interested in exploring in this project, and its continuation, it will be Moran's full dissertation, would be just on this, would be to connect grand corruption to petty corruption in interesting ways. Now, let me just give you examples of what we mean by petty corruption. So petty corruption could be a driver is pulled for a speed violation, and he bribes the officer to not get a ticket. It could be behaviors that seem quite innocent, of individuals giving a present to their doctor in expectation perhaps that when their time comes, they get preferential treatment from that doctor when they need that doctor. It could be store owners that just decide not to report some of their earnings. And it could be a taxi driver that decides not to operationalize the meter. So those are the kind of behaviors that we are interested in. Now, Exposure to corruption is quite prevalent lately. We have seen many cases around the world of politicians, of world leaders, mayors, governors that have been caught in various scandals. This is not just Nixon or such infamous cases. It's all over. Obviously, sometimes they are indicted and charged and booked and go to jail. Sometimes they are found not guilty, but definitely it's prevalent. And my take with people who study corruption, one of my great colleagues in my department is I think Israel is a best scholar on corruption, is that we always had this fight. He studies corruption and said, what do I care about corruption? I don't care about corruption. I don't care if Netanyahu is getting $1 million to doing X or Y, because the effect is quite minimal. What I'm more interested is what is the effect of that behavior by Netanyahu to individuals in society. That's the biggest effect on society, and that's what's actually got me interested in this topic to begin with. Now, when it comes to unethical behavior, we can think of several questions. First of all, we suspect that people who are faced with a greater prize, the temptation becomes greater. So if I'm tempted with, let's go back to last lecture, if the temptation is broccoli, then I'll skip it. But if you give me some pepperoni pizza, maybe I'll do something about it. So we ask our first research question is, does exposure to monetary incentives make people more willing to act corruptly? Our second recent question tries to decipher who are the people more likely to act corrupt. Again, this is not the politicians, these are citizens. So we know that more men than women act corruptly. By the way, more men than women cheat on their spouses. So it's not surprising. We know that corruption is more prevalent when there's a right-wing regime leading the country. We know that people with low levels of education care less about corruption. There's been a great research recently actually about people electing corrupt politicians because it suits them or suits their needs. And finally, we know that in more religious societies, regardless of what religion that is, corruption is more prevalent. We also know, for instance, that people who are richer think that they are entitled to some degree and they act corruptly more than poor people. So we asked, to what extent do social demographic impact the willingness to engage in petty corruption? Finally, we get to the most interesting question for me, which is that we know that by watching television, we actually are influenced by what we see. This is Gerber and over 50 years ago. And we obviously know that the media teaches us what is socially acceptable, not just schools, not just our parents, but we learned what is acceptable and what is not. And we also know that people tend, at least in crime and in other behaviors, and we study basically crime, copycat is quite common. People who see rapes are more likely to actually rape someone than people who did not watch it. Now, so we ask in our third question, can mediated exposure to corruption lead people to engage in petty corruption? We decided to study this case in Israel. Israel is a good case to study corruption. Obviously, it's not as corrupt as Somalia or Syria. However, it's not as clean from corruption like Denmark or New Zealand. In fact, this is the score by Transparency International. So 60 out of 100, where the best country is Denmark with 87. Also, corruption has been quite often in the news in Israel. We have a former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who went to jail for corruption. We have a current former Prime Minister, Netanyahu, who is currently on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. We have our former Minister of Interior, who went to jail for corruption, was appointed again to minister, and again was caught with acts of corruption and is facing a trial right now. Finally, Israel is an interesting case because we have a dark economy, meaning that people are it's common that some people do not report their taxes, that they work without reporting their income. And it's estimated that it costs the Israeli economy about 22% of its GDP. Now, the problem here is that most of the research that deals with corruption, except for very few cases in which it's quite common, studies on Brazil and other countries in which you go and try to cause people to accept a bribe, be it police officers. Most studies of corruption are just attitudinal, self-reported. So you ask people, did you hear about Netanyahu's indictment? Yes. How more willing or less willing are you to trust government to act in such a behavior yourself, and so forth. But we wanted to capture behavior. And to capture behavior, we would just slammed our heads to the table for years until we came up some solution. We think it's a solution. So on how to do a behavioral measure that is, we could find people cheating when they're answering a web survey. So the scheme is as following. First of all, we shot 2 videos, and in these videos, professionally produced videos. So this is Moran, one of our co-authors, and she's a reporter at Channel 1 News. So we had the studio to ourselves, we could use it, and we produced really short newscasts of several news items about an accident, about the weather, about some foreign affairs, and about this case. The 4th story was a story about a mayor that in one condition, the mayor is reported arrested for bribery. In the 2nd story, the mayor opens a new factory of Intel in his own city. So this is the 2 of the 2. So we have a 2 by 2. The second part actually has to do with how to find these individuals cheating. So to come up with that scheme, we said to respondents, and we have 400 respondents across 4 conditions, we told them, you know, lately people are having a hard time following news because of all these multi-screens, and people are so much engaged with their phones that they cannot really understand the news. So we want to plead with you. We're going to give you money to watch the news. Well, one group gets money, one group doesn't get the money. We want to give you an incentive. We're going to ask you, you're going to watch this 5-minute clip, and after the clip, we're going to have you a quiz. And if you answer all 10 questions correctly, you're going to get 50 shekels. 50 shekels, about $15. It's quite a nice sum for usually respondents in these surveys get 2 shekels, 3 shekels. So 50 shekels, it's a lot of money. But you have to answer every question correctly. So they go through the questions, and some of them are open-ended, some are closed-ended. What was the color of the shirt of the newscaster? What was the weather like? And so it goes. No matter what they answer, they say, great, you answered correctly, move forward. And in the almost last question, we asked them, what is the name of the Prime Minister of Iceland who criticized Trump? The name of the Prime Minister was not mentioned in the broadcast. So we just called her the Prime Minister of Iceland. And we suspected that the people in Israel don't know what her name is. She's not that popular in Israel. So all persons that actually will answer correctly that question would have to Google it. And we asked them, we told them in the first place, you're not allowed to go back. You're not allowed to Google. You're supposed to remember the newscast and respond just from memory. So that's the behavior that we call it busted. So this method we call it busted. Behaviors uncovered in simulated tests exposing deception. So that's the research design, 2 by 2. So some people saw the indicted, the arrested case. Some people saw the mayor inaugurating a factory. Some people got 50 shekels. Some people got 0 shekels to do the same thing. And what did we find? Well, money talks. So when you give people money, they are more likely to cheat. So our question 1, RQ1 is confirmed. About 30% of the people who watched the story, and 25% who watched the other story, the mayor opening a factory, actually when the incentive was 50%. So people went on Google and they gave us the name of the mayor. Some even gave it in Icelandic, so they just copied it from the website of Iceland or something, but they all found this person.
Sorry, we have 2 minutes left, if you can repeat
okay.
the 2 minutes. Yeah.
Perfect. As to who are the people who are the cheaters, so we found that obviously the only thing that stands out is that people who voted for right-wing parties are more likely to cheat. And finally, when it comes to exposure to the news story, we didn't find, as you saw also from the graphs, we didn't find a main effect. So we couldn't find a significant difference between the people who were exposed to the condition of that they saw corruption and the other group. So what do we get from all this? So basically, what could be at work here? Why didn't we find the main effect for corruption? We suspected we should. And the reason may be that corruption is prevalent in Israeli news media. So just by adding one more story about corruption in a country in which the prime minister, at the time when we did it, the prime minister is under an indictment and the beginning of a trial for corruption, in which every day we have new stories and testimonies about the behaviors, what it did, and so forth. So maybe our story doesn't add much. So we think that perhaps, we don't think, we plan on replicating this study, and we already shot similar videos in English in the same studio, the same stories, but in English. And we're going to test it in the US and see whether in the US, where corruption is not that common, as in Israel, maybe just the adding of one corrupt story would bring a major change in what we see. But regardless, we are very happy with the methodology itself, and those of you who in the future want to consult or perhaps collaborate, we'll be happy to do so, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions on how to make it better. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I'm going to jump into the first question from Christian. I was wondering if you asked people, my chat is frozen, but I remember the question was, he was wondering if you asked people at the end if they had Googled the name just to get the honest cheaters. Who are the honest cheaters?
If they what? Again, I didn't get that. If they confessed
at the end, if they
if
you ask them, have you Googled the name of the
well, just getting the IRB for this was very tricky. So we had to go through several rounds to make sure that we don't violate any regulations. So for instance, we paid everybody the money, regardless of if they got it correctly or not, because it would be unfair, because you cannot answer correctly the survey without cheating. So there were a handful of individuals across 4 groups that said, it didn't appear in the video, her name was not there, I'm kind of certain. So everybody got 50 shekels regardless. So we couldn't probe them further to not humiliate them. We thought about it, but people said, we cannot humiliate people, and you're not supposed to know that they cheated.
Next one, a really interesting study. Great to see research on licensing effects. There are literatures on this in social psychology and economics, for example, in amplifying deception or willingness to engage in racist abuse on the street. How do we isolate the effects of one-off exposure to a message or incentives versus the cascading network effects that we know lead people to mimic others' behaviors? Big question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer on top of my head. Obviously, mimicking is part of it. Obviously, here we're doing it in isolation. So the only effect that should take place would be the difference between the exposure of the 2 groups. So any difference accounted between the 2 groups would be kind of the effect on the individual, but I will have to think further on that. But thanks for that.
Okay, so I think we have some time for more questions. In the meantime, I'll just tell you what I thought of. So I think my first one, and I'm looking at the paper now because when I went through, I don't remember you saying about power calculations. So can you tell us, if you remember, what would be the effect that you could detect with this number of participants? Because to me, it seems that the difference between the monetary incentive in the no monetary incentive group versus the monetary incentive group, I see that maybe there are some differences between exposure and control, but then I'm wondering if this is because you have a few hundred respondents, and if you could, what is it that you could really capture with this sample, and is this a smaller effect than that?
Yeah, I think we did power effects. It's currently under review, and I suspect that it wouldn't hold. I don't perhaps with 1,000 respondents, obviously, but this is a very expensive design, mind you. That we have to pay, in addition to the survey, we have to pay $15 to each respondent, and so this makes it very costly. So just even increasing by twofold would not give us the power needed. And we suspect that the results should hold. We don't think that in Israel we will find that effect. But as we're moving forward to do this in the US, we definitely are thinking of running the same numbers and then perhaps doubling the size in the US to see if we see there's something there. But it may be the case that it's a null study, and we have to accept it. And hopefully now that papers that are null results are even published, so maybe that's our contribution. But the contribution, I think, also is just a methodology that people could adopt it to other kind of behaviors.
Yes, I agree with that. And we're going to go back now quickly to the treatment, or actually to the dependent variables. So I'm reading now, if some people realized that the name was not in the video, perhaps their Googling could not be classified as cheating. It would be more like, they must have made a mistake, or am I okay to Google it? I wonder whether your results hold excluding these.
Well, we don't have people that reported that. So we have only a handful that said the data was not there, but it's not like somebody engaged with us and say, hey, you're cheating me of this. The only people that wrote in the comments, again, it's a handful perhaps that even said that. And there was a handful of other people, and again, I think less than 10 that said, I don't remember, I couldn't remember, things like that. They were like, like students when they tell you, I knew this at class, but I currently don't remember, but perhaps you can give me a few points. So it sounded like that. It went too fast, so I don't know if there's a way to just drop those individuals. But again, it will be, and it's across groups. Not just the monetary group, we put it that it wasn't there. We saw it across groups that people said a handful. That's it. It's not there.
And then if there's no more, then what I was thinking about when I was reading your research design, and then before that, the hypotheses, I thought, I was a bit odd that you look at these different predictors and you call them controls for corruption behavior. But wouldn't it be also super interesting to look at treatment heterogeneity? So like looking at these variables, and so who are the people who are likely to respond to the actual treatment? So it's not about whether they are men more corrupt than women, but are men more likely to mimic what they see? Does the treatment work for them? And then I saw that you don't have a significant main effect. So obviously this is wishful thinking, and I don't say that you try to chop up your sample even more. But I'm wondering if, maybe did you explore, maybe did you look at some subgroups? Are there treatment effects somewhere? I'm not suggesting this is what you should do, but more conversationally.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, the numbers, as you say, are a bit small. We had high hopes, for instance, for gender, and we thought we're going to see something meaningful there, but we didn't find any within our sample. But again, those are things that as we move forward to the US data, hopefully there with a sample of 800, we'll be able to dissect more inner groups. By the way, obviously in Israel, we did it only among Jews because we didn't want to intersect another variable there of perhaps Arabs, they have Hebrew as a second language, and perhaps they didn't understand the instructions, or they didn't understand the news, and therefore it's only among people who are Hebrew first language.
Right. All right, thanks for that. I think that now maybe it's time to move on to the third and last paper. So thank you for that. So that would be the Amakov paper. Does identity matter, ethnicity, religion, and effects of negative campaigning?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm going to be presenting a topic, does identity matter, ethnicity, religion, and effects of negative campaigning on the perception of candidates. Currently, I'm a student at the Michigan State University, but this study was conducted while I was at the University of Amsterdam, and I will just be sharing some parts of the study with you. I would actually dwell on the context, and I would look at the research question that guided the study and touch on the theories that actually I built on while conducting the study. And I will share with you the hypothesis, the method, and also I would give some concluding remarks on what I found out. But first, I would like to present with you this. Sometime in the build up to the elections in 2015, Nigerians were surprised by this advertorial on the pages of the newspaper. And this was a governor, a former governor that was actually campaigning for the then president, Jonathan. And you can see the words there, Nigerians be warned, life and death. Therefore choose life that both thee and thy seed may live. This is drawn from a biblical reference, and it talks about the fact that Nigerians should be careful of who they make as their next president. But this actually was quite negative, and it received a whole lot of backlash. Also in this context, we have the former governor of one of the popular states in Nigeria, Lagos State, actually going negative against his contender in the build-up to the 2019 elections. The combination of the 2015 and 2019 elections actually spurred my thinking. Why do politicians go negative? What actually influences their decision to go negative? And for me, I was more interested in knowing, how does this have an effect on people when they identify with the politician, both as a sponsor and the target of these attacks? And this actually shaped how I decided to actually go into this study. We all know that, so for my question, I said, okay, to what extent do religiosity and ethnicity determine the effectiveness of negative campaigns on the perception of candidates? We know in multi-ethnic states, people actually identify based on where they come from, what region they come from, what language they speak, and actually the religion they feel comfortable being with. And so this actually guided what I wanted to study. But we all know that negative campaigning is actually an age-old concept. So it's not something that just started today. And we know that every point in time, politicians will always go negative. And they feel that's the best way to actually get more supporters, win people that are swing voters, and actually boost their chances of winning on the election day. So, but for this study, I kind of tried to base my research on the directional lens of negative campaigning. Based on the literature, we have the evaluative lens, we have the directional lens. But for the directional lens, we look at a two-pronged approach to looking at negative campaigning. And that's when negative campaigning is based on a policy based attack, and also when a negative campaign is actually personal. So when it's personal, you are focusing on the personality of the candidate. You are maybe abusing maybe his mental health, maybe he has some challenges, and you're bringing it to the fore and trying to use it as a campaign tool to bolster your party. But when it is policy based, you're looking at, okay, what are the things that my opponent is actually proposing? Does it make sense? And instead of actually arguing with facts, you are saying that, oh, we can't take this hook, line, and sinker. This does not make sense. This is balderdash, and we cannot accept him as our next candidate for this position. So that's where I actually situate this study for today. Then also another dynamics that I actually was interested in looking at is the intergroup dynamics. We've always seen in the literature that intergroup dynamics is actually focused on party affiliations. In the US, for example, where I am, party affiliations is actually the major fulcrum of negative campaigning and social identification. But we don't know much about what happens when people identify more by their ethnic group and where what religion they actually feel very aligned to. And so that's why I actually said, okay, let's give more to this study, let's give more to this body of literature and actually see how we can affect this. Then also we talk about affective polarization by Shanto and Iyengar and the likes, and where they talk about the fact that based on where you align, it actually affects how you see things, how you actually accept and process information that you come across. But one thing that is very sure is that when people are from a particular ethnic group, when people find themselves with a particular ethnic group, they actually feel that they feel very connected to that person, and everything they do would be aligned to supporting that candidate. And that's what we see in the literature. So what really happens when people go negative? We know that politicians go negative, but what really happens? One, there's a blanket negativity. So this is what colleagues in 94 talks about, the fact that, okay, when there's a negativity that rules an election period, people actually feel disinterested, they feel withdrawn from that election, and it actually causes a kind of apathy. Then also we see that there's a backlash effect that happens when someone actually goes negative. There's a tendency for people to feel that that person going negative is not doing the right thing and would actually want to not support the person. Then we've also seen that in Nigeria that political mobilization has been centered on ethnic coloration and religious sentiment. And so, for example, you would not have the vice president and the president come from a particular ethnic group or identify with a particular religion because of how polarized this kind of discussion happens within the Nigerian context. And also, we can see in the literature that the trust and support of the target candidate by the in-group members actually increases when there is an attack. So based on this, I actually hypothesize that one, policy-based negative attack is less likely to cause a backlash effect than personal-based message for the sponsor candidate. And the second hypothesis I look at is the fact that, okay, a personal-based attack is actually more likely to reduce the perception of voters about that candidate that has been attacked. And while doing this, I decided to actually do a survey embedded online experiment, and we had about over 200 participants in the survey, and I tried to ask them, okay, what's their level of interest in politics? And actually, to some extent, they had a moderate amount of interest in politics. But it's very clear to state that this was conducted not within the election period. So we used hypothetical candidates to actually test this hypothesis to see how true it is. And then for me to do that, I ensured that the candidates that were used were both similar, but they differed based on ethnicity and religion. And if you understand the Nigerian context, to some extent, there's this sharp divide between the North and the South. Although if you drill down, there might be some other salient issues that might have not been covered in this study, but the major fulcrum is, okay, there's a division based on the place where they come from and the religion which they identify with. So we presented them with a policy-based negative campaign message and also a personal-based negative campaign message. And then we tried to ensure that we designed it in a way that it addresses issues of validity and the likes. And we also know that there are concerns when you have a hypothetical candidate and it raises issues about validity. But we tried as much as possible to ensure that the treatment actually showed how it relates to the context which we were studying. And also we also made them know that, okay, there's just a sudden call for a presidential election. And we want to know what you would do if this happens. So this is just an example of the kinds of messages that we showed them. This is based on a personal attack on a candidate by the sponsor candidate. And then this is based on policy. These messages are actually true. They were taken from real life examples and just embedded in a WhatsApp format and a Twitter format, just to see how people engage with it and understand better. So descriptively, what we were able to find out is that across board, people were more likely to support and have a good perception of the target candidate. So the person that was receiving the attack, people felt that he was competent, he was a leader, he was trustworthy, he was likable, and if they voted him, he would actually represent their interest. Then also, we looked at what's the propensity for them to vote, and it also showed that people across all the groups felt that based on what they've read about the messages, the target candidate would be their preferred candidate of choice if they were to vote in such an election. So that shows that to an extent, the sponsor candidate was not able to win the support of the participants in the study. So it takes me to my first hypothesis. So is there really a backlash effect for the sponsor candidates? From what we found out, I wouldn't say that there is a true backlash effect. This could be because of several reasons, which I feel it's something that can be further drilled down in further studies, but I didn't see any backlash effect in that. Then also, what was the perception of the target candidate? How do they see it? So in doing this, I actually controlled for some variables: gender, age, education. And we can actually see that our hypothesis on the fact that the perception of the target candidate when its policy would reduce, we can see to some extent the hypothesis, we can't actually reject it. But I was still not sure about how this applies, because in the data we had a kind of skewed group. So we had more people for the target candidate. So what I did was I tried to see within the in-group members of the target candidate, how do they perceive their candidate when there is a negative campaign message? And from what I can see, a personal-based message actually reduces the perception of in-group members about the target candidate. So when a sponsor candidate goes negative using personal attributes and the likes, there's a tendency for the in-group members of that target candidate to actually reduce their support and perception for that candidate. Although this is counterintuitive and it goes against what we know in the literature, but I think to some extent it makes a whole lot of sense in how we understand that identity and how we understand the role of ethnicity and religion in the context which I studied. So I go back to my first question, big question, does identity matter? Yes, it matters, but there's an extent to which identity matters. And we've seen that, okay, a personal-based negative campaign message has a tendency to reduce the perception of voters if they are in-group members. So going forward, I see this as a conversation starter. Not much is known about how other social identifiers affect people's perception of candidates when there's a negative campaign message. So it calls for more study. It also calls for more look into how online communication channels, WhatsApp, Twitter, are being used by supporters of candidates to actually push this narrative, and what are the affordances these platforms give people to actually engage with these messages. And that is where I would rest my study for today. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I welcome your questions, I welcome your suggestions, and further ways to actually improve the study. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So we have about 8 minutes, so that's not much, but there's still opportunity for a few questions, and one that we have here in the chat box says, I would be interested in other identity markers like group, party solidarity for further research. So I think it's an open question for you.
Yeah, it's also something that one can consider. But at the point in time when I was looking at it, I didn't consider that. But yeah, it's something welcome. Yeah, thank you.
And I think my question was, when I was listening to this also, I think the social identity markers were kind of, we've seen a lot here. We've seen some religion, we've seen ethnicity, but actually in the research design, what you presented, unless I misunderstood it, it's really like two broad categories. So you said northern versus southerner, right? So, and this is a mixture of different things, and both of them come with a baggage of both religion. And so I was wondering if in the paper, when you're writing this, if the framing is about something quite general, in-group, out-group, or do you want to really start teasing out the relative? I don't know if this makes any sense. Maybe you're just going to say this is nonsense, but is this really about religion? Is this really about some other? So I think that'd be a good, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And if you're to drill down to the dynamics within this ethnicity and religion, then it might be an issue. So what I did was I looked at it from a holistic point of view. So the in-group and out-group. So if you're an in-group, that means you identify with the ethnic group of the politician and the religion of the politician. That was how I looked at it. So it's more of an in-group, out-group dynamics. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have one more question. Could power considerations explain some of your null findings? The magnitude of some of the effects you showed was not small, if I understood correctly.
Well, yeah, power effects are actually also considerations when you look at these kinds of study. But due to the kind of restriction I had and the time I had, that was how I was able to get the responses. I would have loved to get more, but I think it's also something to consider in further studies in terms of the power effect and how it affects the results of the study. Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to now use this and then move the paper forward, or are you expecting to collect more data? Because that wasn't clear for me. So is this something that you want to go back to the field and do it again, or?
Yeah, it's for further studies is something that one can actually tease out more and collect more data to actually understand more dynamics, probably within even an election context, since this was more of a hypothetical. Yeah.
Right. And I was also just looking at I really, really liked your experimental prompts, and I think it looks very good. But when I look at something like a WhatsApp forwarded message, that makes me think about, oh, is this another piece of misinformation research? Or there's all sorts of things, like you showed something that was forwarded from an unknown source. Could there be maybe an effect of the fact that there is no source credibility on these prompts because you're using social media? So is that maybe something that you were also thinking about? Like if you use the news article with a headline, then that would have source, whereas a forwarded WhatsApp message doesn't have a source. So I'm just thinking if this is something you want to also do it to be maybe systematically, so a bunch of them get that, a bunch of get the WhatsApp version, would that be maybe something you thought about?
Yeah, but actually when you receive a WhatsApp message, it has a name saved. So it's more of like a person on your contact list actually forwarded a message to you. So that's why I talk about the affordances of the platform. So when you receive a message from someone that is from a contact list, and there's a tendency for you to accept that message than when you just see something online or something like that. So it's not something I considered fully in the study, but I think it's something that can actually be explored more. Yeah.
All right. So I think unless there are more questions, we still have a few minutes, which I think is only enough. So if you want to ask, is there anything you want to ask us, or is there some specific feedback that maybe you were missing or you were curious what we thought, then maybe we can answer that in a minute, or otherwise we can move on to the next panel very soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Laszlo, and thank you to all the panelists. I want to apologize because I've realized that some of you might as well, that only male colleagues presented at this last panel, and that is due to a mistake I've made in the planning of the conference, for which I very much apologize to all of you.